Max Verstappen took his 8th Grand Prix victory in a row from 6th on the grid in Belgium. It was a calm and assured drive in a race that never really felt like it got going at Spa, with tricky conditions and different tyre strategies. There's lots to talk about going into the summer break, so here's my 5 things we learned from the Belgian Grand Prix. Let's have a look. My name's Andy, and this is Behind the Drive. Red Bull's dominance continues. Despite having a 5-place grid drop for taking too many gearboxes, Max Verstappen comfortably made his way past the cars ahead of him to take the win in Belgium. It was another comfortable victory for Verstappen as he continues to get the most out of his Red Bull car on every circuit type. His drive up the order past the other cars was calm and controlled, and he didn't take too many risks. He was aware that he would be able to get ahead of the other cars eventually, and even beating his teammate didn't seem to be a concern for Red Bull's #1 driver. Meanwhile, Sergio Perez delivered under the pressure once again as he took 2nd place for the first time since the Miami Grand Prix back in May. This was a big result for Perez as he has shown that he can get his car ahead of all the other teams on occasions. This result will be making his position in the team more secure, with Ricciardo still getting up to speed in that AlphaTauri. What was particularly interesting with Perez's drive was that when we were on board with Max, we could see the Dutch driver hitting every apex and making the most of his car, but the Mexican driver was missing apexes and taking most of the corners very wide by comparison. This shows why Max is the driver to beat this season, and where Perez needs to learn from his teammate. For Verstappen, there was some tension on the radio throughout this weekend with his race engineer. In qualifying, Verstappen was frustrated as he only got through to Q3 after finishing 10th in Q2. It was a challenging session for all the teams given the changing conditions and the track was much faster right at the end. Verstappen was frustrated at the run plan, which was really a non-issue as the driver was through into the next stage anyway. From there, in the race, there were a few uncomfortable interactions between Giampiero Lambiase and Verstappen, with the driver giving interesting responses on the radio when asked about his tyres relating to the weather, and then some other pieces on the strategy and tyre wear as well. It was a sign that Verstappen felt very comfortable with his position, and the fact that he knew he would be comfortably winning the race. But for me, it's also potentially a sign of complacency, which given his performances over the last few months, could well be a risk. On the whole, Red Bull were excellent this afternoon in Belgium once again. Their car is strong at every single circuit, and their tyre wear at Spa was particularly impressive. So it's got to be a green box for Red Bull this weekend. McLaren Setup put them back in the midfield. With the McLaren team making significant progress through the season, there has been more opportunity for both Norris and Piastri. Norris has capitalised so far with 2 podiums from the last 2 Grand Prix, and Piastri has been just behind, with a 4th place finish in Silverstone which should have been 3rd, and then he ran 2nd in Hungary before reported damage which dropped him down the order. This weekend was an opportunity for McLaren to show their pace once again. They are going to have a challenge to catch up to the other teams in the fight for 2nd in this championship through the second half of the season. But in order to catch up with those teams, they need to keep being the 2nd fastest team. In Belgium, the team struggled to keep up that pace. They opted for a higher downforce setup, which has never been the optimum for this track given the long straight, which is the best overtaking opportunity. By adding downforce, the team were better suited for the wet conditions, which were forecasted throughout the weekend. This worked out in qualifying and in the sprint as the drivers were strong through Sector 2 and were able to keep ahead down the straight in the damp conditions. But given the race was mostly dry with DRS throughout, then McLaren was a sitting duck down the straight with the higher downforce. In addition, both drivers had issues. Piastri had terminal damage from his lap 1 incident with Sainz, and Norris reportedly had steering issues as well. But it wasn't just these and slower straight line speed that was the issue. The drivers also lost out when it came to tyre wear. The additional downforce meant their tyres degraded significantly more than their rival teams, and this was evident in both the sprint race and in the Grand Prix, with Norris being one of the only drivers to use the hard compound tyre during the Grand Prix. In the end, the British driver managed to make a long stint on the soft tyres work, so their degradation did reduce once their fuel load was lighter, which is what secured him a 7th place finish. I think McLaren took a risk with the setup this weekend, and while it paid off in the sprint race with Piastri's 2nd place, it didn't work out for the main event, which is when most of the points are given. For me, it's an amber box for McLaren. I anticipate that they'll be able to continue to perform well in the second half of the year, but I believe they made a mistake this weekend, so it's an amber box for me. Before we take a look at one of the main reasons why this race was a bit disappointing, I want to take a moment to ask you to subscribe to Behind the Drive. Based on the latest data, more than 75% of you watching are not yet subscribed to the channel, so if that's you and you're enjoying the content, then please hit the subscribe button. Sainz's incident makes the race a bit disappointing. Carlos Sainz had a pretty disappointing start to the Belgian Grand Prix. Starting in fourth, the Spaniard had a chance to make his way forward and potentially fight for a podium in a car that seemed to be in a good place this weekend. But instead, the driver made an error going into turn 1. The Ferrari driver locked up and was 3 wide going into turn 1, with Hamilton on his left and Piastri up the inside. But the lock-up from Sainz resulted in him closing the gap to Piastri, pushing the McLaren into the wall and out of the race. The incident went unpenalised for Sainz, as the stewards tend to be lenient with lap 1 turn 1 incidents, but for me, Sainz was clearly not in control of his car. It was an optimistic and perhaps naive move from Piastri to go for that move into the inside of turn 1, given there tends to be several incidents in that corner, and if you look at starts at Belgium over the last few years, it tends to be a pinch point off the line. But I think Sainz was predominantly at fault for the incident itself, which put both him and Piastri out of the race entirely. Sainz had significant side pod damage following the turn 1 collision, and therefore he was significantly slower than the other cars on the circuit. Despite this, he kept Lance Stroll behind him well, which resulted in the top 4 runners leading from the rest of the pack by almost 20 seconds. This gap then didn't close for the rest of the Grand Prix, with Hamilton ending ahead of Alonso by more than 20 seconds before his late pit stop. Once Sainz stopped and dropped to the back of the pack, he stood no chance of catching up to the rest of the cars, and it made sense for the team to retire the car. For me, Sainz was more responsible for the incident into turn 1 than any other driver, as he wasn't in control of his car with the lockup. It would have been a harsh penalty, but it was a shame to see the outcome have consequences to other drivers and the whole Grand Prix. For me, this performance was deserving of an amber box, as it was all lost through turn 1 for Sainz, despite having a car that was capable of getting on the podium. Alonso's recovery drive shows he's down but not out. Alonso's drive from 9th to 5th in this race ensured he kept hold of 3rd in the Drivers' Championship going into the summer break with a 1-point lead over Lewis Hamilton. The Spaniard started off the year incredibly well, but it seems like the Aston Martin has dropped back relative to their rivals through the season so far. This has meant that while podium finishes were common through the first races of the year, they've since been harder to come by for Aston Martin, but Alonso delivered well to take home 10 points from this race. Earlier in the weekend, Alonso had a rare off through the first sprint race as he lost control of his car and beached it in the gravel. His teammate also had an off in the challenging conditions on Saturday, but it's a rare sight for Alonso to end up in the gravel. It was a good recovery then to get 5th place in the Grand Prix, and it is a sign that Aston Martin have started to figure out what has gone wrong in the last few races. It's been reported that the upgrades that came in for Canada actually made the car less predictable and harder to set up, but now they've understood this, they may have been able to get the car back into a place where they can compete. Alonso has also been complaining about the tyres in the last few Grand Prix, which was another topic of conversation this weekend, as the Pirelli wet tyres seemed to be useless in the sprint race, with all the drivers going into the pits early on once they were no longer behind the safety car. But it seems like Aston Martin will be able to establish what they need to do to get their car back into the fight for the second half of the year, following potential upgrades after the summer break. So for me, it's a green box for Alonso's Grand Prix performance this weekend, and there seems to be light at the end of the tunnel. Yuki Tsunoda beats Daniel Ricciardo. The battle between the new AlphaTauri teammates will be a critical one going into the second half of the year. These first 2 rounds for Ricciardo will be seen as an opportunity to get used to the car and up to speed, but Yuki Tsunoda has already put in an impressive performance in Belgium to secure points for only the 3rd time this year, which will show the benchmark that Ricciardo will need to beat to previous talent. The AlphaTauri car is clearly very difficult to drive, but Tsunoda has done his best through the year and secured all of the 3 points for that team so far. Tsunoda's good performance in Belgium was set up by a great qualifying performance on Friday, where he took 11th position on the grid. This would put him in a good position to progress forwards, and it didn't take him long to get back behind Carlos Sainz as the Ferrari driver struggled. As Tsunoda got past, he quickly built a gap to the other cars that were struggling to get past Sainz, which helped him to secure the final points finishing position and the checkered flag. For me, it's another good result for Tsunoda, as he's been getting the most from his poor car this year. It's another step in the right direction, and it'll be interesting to see how he gets on against Ricciardo for the rest of the 2023 season. So it's got to be a green box for Tsunoda for his race in Belgium. Honourable mentions. A key honourable mention for me today has to be Charles Leclerc and Ferrari for their first podium since Austria. It was a strong performance, as he was only beaten by the 2 Red Bull drivers on this occasion. It's a good result to take them into the summer break with some momentum. The second and final honourable mention for me will be for Pierre Gasly's sprint race top 3. It was a chaotic race with the changeable conditions, but he and Alpine got the strategy right on this occasion and ensured that they took that top 3 performance. What this shows was how the same car can be different from one day to another, given the Alpine of Gasly was 11th in the dry running on Sunday. So the first half of the year is complete, and Red Bull are still the dominant force in Formula 1. For them, they'll go into this break knowing that they are now looking to break records in the rest of the 2023 season and not really fight for the championship.